Thanks so much to all my patrons. Join now to help support the channel and help pick the books I review on this channel. Link in the description. And I am done. Okay, so I just got done listening to Traitor's Blade. This is the first book in the Greatcoats series by Sebastien de Castell, and I'm going to give you my unedited thoughts when finishing this book, which was literally just right now. So yeah, this thing was a stinker. I did not enjoy this book. I'm going to give it 2 stars, and yeah, didn't like it. I did thoroughly enjoy this book up until about a quarter of the way in, and then it just started going downhill and then flying down the hill from that point forward. And that's frustrating because I felt like there was a lot of promise here, and I felt like what was being set up was this really fun buddy Three Musketeers type thing that I didn't know that I wanted in my life, but was awesome and really enjoyable. And it had these vibes that I haven't gotten since I read 𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬 by Michael J. Sullivan. And I really like 𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬. And I want to go back and read more 𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬. In fact, I think I have some plans this year to kind of restart that series again and do a reread of it, because it's a really enjoyable kind of palate cleanser type book of these best friends who are trying to do the right thing, who are a little more sarcastic and witty, and it's just a fun break from the hardcore books that I'm used to reading. And so I was like, you know, I remember throwing on my audiobook, and I was doing some work out back, you know, cleaning up the leaves, because I have these redwoods all throughout my backyard, and I have like 8 redwoods in my backyard, and twice a year they just dump needles everywhere, and I have to do a ton of yard work to get them all cleaned up. And I was working on this, and I threw this book on, not expecting much, and I just had this big smile on my face working. I was like, this is so enjoyable. I really love this thing. And then, at a certain point, the plot just twists around. It tells the story that I did not want to be told, and it started doing some very strange things that just made me struggle to read it, and I ultimately almost DNF'd it. So let's talk a little bit more about this in detail. Let's talk a little bit about the plot, and we'll go from there. So the plot essentially follows the adventures of 𝐒𝐿𝐼𝐼 and his companions, who were all members of this group called the Greatcoats. And the Greatcoats are like this group of, I think they're like officially judges, but they're like badass judges that have swords. And they travel the land and ensure that the king's justice is available to everybody. So it felt like I said, the Three Musketeers, but with some fantasy elements to it. And, you know, there's certainly books out there that have this traveling justice type thing. A very popular series that had just got wrapped up was The Empire of the Wolf. The first book being Empire of Justice of Kings. How did I get that so wrong? Justice of Kings. And so it felt like it was doing some stuff like that. I was like, okay, this is going to be great. I love Justice of Kings. This is going to be great. But as the story opens up, the king is dead, and the Greatcoats are effectively disbanded and seen as traitors by everybody. And the reasons for them being considered traitors are not obvious at the beginning. It becomes clear as the book goes along. But 𝐒𝐿𝐼𝐼 and his buddies, they've remained loyal to the king, even though the king's dead. They're loyal to that memory of the king and the ideals and why he created this group of them in the first place. And they feel like their duty was not to the king, it was to the concept of the king. And they want to follow through with their journey, and they end up having these fun sword fights, and it's like swashbuckling, and, you know, these unscrupulous nobles, and they're trying to fulfill this mission that the king gave to 𝐒𝐿𝐼𝐼 and his friends before he died, and I was all there for it. I was all there for Quest A as it got set out. But most of the book ended up being Quest B, which was quite a bore, and it ended up splitting up the Three Musketeers, which I'm going to call them for the rest of this because I feel like it's perfectly fitting. And Story A was the fun. Story B was a chore. And it left that. And it's like, man, I feel like this promise was out there that I was going to get this story that I was all in for. And it just had this feeling of getting the rug kind of pulled out under from me and just feeding me something horrific. And now I'm sure that a ton of people who read this are going to feel exactly opposite. And they're going to say, Story A sucked. I almost DNF'd it. Story B is much better. Thank God that we went in that direction. And now I can have 5+ books, because I think this series is at least 5 books, of some fun adventures to go on with this group. But for me, it was the opposite, and why I'm not going to end up finishing this series. You know, it felt like there was some weird writing choices here with the characters. At the beginning, I enjoyed it. At the beginning of books, often when there's multiple characters and it's not just like one central character, but in this one we have three, that it can be hard for me to differentiate these characters, and it takes time. And as it goes along, I start to realize the different kind of things that differentiate these people, and I can really get a clear picture of these three characters in my head. Not just the names, but like what makes them who they are, because good authors make characters very different from each other. That's a compelling character traits that make you interested in reading about them in more detail. But I ultimately kind of feel like, even after finishing this book, that it was like three of the same person. They're just these really witty characters that make these witty statements and filled with sarcasm, and they all just kind of ultimately blend together and make kind of the same character. Like, I just finished the book, right? And I can't tell you the differences between these three characters other than, you know, one's an archer, one's good with the sword. You know, there's these things that about some of the skills they have, but not their character traits themselves that make them unique individuals. And that's unfortunate, right? That's not what you want to hear at all. Perhaps a bigger problem I had with this book is the increasingly large amount of Deus Ex Machina. I cannot say that term. I know, is it Deus Ex Machina? Deus Ex Machina? Deus or Deus? Machina? Machina? I think it's Deus Ex Machina. Somebody correct me, please, in the comments. They gotta make a YouTube channel, and I can just have people correct me, and I can have a bunch of fact checkers all around, so I don't have to ask Alexa for everything in the other room. But it's very constant. If you're not familiar with that term, essentially, you know, there's a conflict, and all of a sudden the conflict gets solved by something that doesn't feel earned or set up. And it's just like, oh, that kind of sucked. Like, you could have written that better. Constant in this story. And some of them are so poorly written. And I don't like to say poorly written often because things are subjective, right? But objectively, there were some twists in this that were bad. And I had to actually, you know, I have a schedule, right? I'm trying to read my books on time. I don't like to go back and read stuff if I don't have to, but there was a couple scenes in here where I had to go back and read them again to make sure that I read the ridiculous thing that I had just read, that I actually read it right. Because I was like, there's no way that this author actually wrote that. And he did. And so I don't want to go into detail about what they are. I don't want to ruin anything for you in case you're planning on reading this thing. And ultimately, you know, this, I'm not going to not recommend this book to you. There's some things to like about this. But I don't want to ruin anything for you nonetheless. This is spoiler free. There are also, not to go into too many things that I hated about this thing, but I didn't like much about it other than the very brief beginning part of this book. But this book utilizes a tool that I can find can be expertly done or horribly done with not a lot in the middle. And it's time jumping and scene jumping, where you have a story going on, the main story, and they constantly have these flashback stories that go in and fill in some gaps so you understand more about what's going on, or you know, something big will happen and then they'll go back and be like, oh, here's why that happened, or, you know, here's the history of this character learning about this as their child, so now it ties in. This is one of the poorer examples of it. You know, I read recently Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia, and that was one of the better versions of it. The times that they jumped back, and it was not constant, it was frequent, but not all the time. It was when it was needed. And every time it was done, it's like, okay, that felt like it perfectly made sense why we went back in time. In this one, it felt a little bit random. It felt annoying. It didn't really feel like the flashback time jump kind of scenes fit a purpose within the story. And ultimately, it just served to be too cute. It's like the author's like, oh, this would be cool to do. It would be, good writers do this. And it adds a little twist to the storytelling. But I think ultimately what Sebastien de Castell should have found out is that good authors use this when it's called for. And it wasn't called for here, at least not for me. And it just took away a lot of the story for me. So, yeah, this was a struggle. I definitely not going to finish up this series. And I can see why this book is a little bit lower rated on something like a Goodreads. I don't like to just look at Goodreads ratings or Amazon ratings and be like, oh, a good book has high ratings, a bad book has low ratings. But in general, books should have, almost every good fantasy book will have more 5-star ratings than 4 stars, and more 4 than 3, and more 3 than 2, and more 2 than 1. You'll see this curve to the rankings. And this one's not. This one has more 4 stars than 5 stars, and that's not a great sign. And I'd be interested to look at like what book in 2s and 3s have, if they get a pretty sizable bump up in scores. They should, because the only people reading them are the people that are into the series. But sometimes they take a backward step, and that's a really bad sign. So I don't love using Goodreads as gospel, but there are some things that you can take from that data and make good sense of, and I feel like that's one of them. So yeah, not great sign, but maybe this will fit for you. Give it a try. See, it's not a very long book. And the audiobook narration was quite well done, I will say. The audiobook narrator has done other stuff. I don't know what I've read that's had this audiobook narrator, but I've certainly picked up on this voice, and it's something I attribute with enjoyable, fun voice acting. So good stuff on that end. So if you need a pretty quick audiobook read, this wouldn't be a bad one to try out and see if it's good for you. So that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching this review, and as always, happy reading to you. Thanks again to all of my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier and Librarian tier patrons: Anna G, CJ, Doust, Darren, Gil, Gregory, JD, Jonathan, Nathan T, Nev's Book Channel, 𝗏𝗏𝗏, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L, Sydney Baker, Tay C, Tahir, Tommy, Zion, Anna, Andra, Blair, Brock, Evan, Joe UK, Kat Mick, Michael Sugarman, Philippe, Sky, and 𝗏𝗏𝗏. Thanks for sticking to the end of this video, and if you want to watch some more content from my channel, click over here and I've got some good videos for you. Thanks so much.